Tom Grady's weathered hands signed papers for cursed ground while the whole town whispered behind his back. The haunted ranch, that's what they called it, spitting the words like poison from their lips. 66 years of living had taught him that what others feared often held the greatest truth. His black mare, Sable, stood silent in the trailer, her dark eyes reflecting something the townspeople couldn't see. The deed felt heavy in his calloused palm, heavier than any weapon he'd carried in distant wars. Everyone mocked the veteran for buying a haunted ranch, but Tom had learned long ago that mockery often preceded miracle. Subscribe now, because some discoveries can only be found by those brave enough to dig where others fear to tread. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cracked adobe walls of what the locals called the Devil's Acre, though Tom Grady knew better than to trust the superstitions of small-town minds. He'd driven his pickup truck down the rutted dirt road at dawn, the trailer behind him carrying Sable and everything he owned, while the good people of Esperanza slept safely in their beds, dreaming dreams untainted by the kind of darkness Tom had seen in foreign lands. The ranch stretched before him like a forgotten prayer, its broken fences and weathered buildings standing as monuments to some long-buried shame that the town refused to name. Sable nickered softly from the trailer, her voice the only sound besides the desert wind that seemed to carry whispers from decades past. Tom stepped down from the truck, his boots hitting the hard-packed earth with the same certainty that had carried him through jungles and deserts where other men had fallen. The air tasted of sage and secrets, of time and truth, waiting to be unearthed by hands unafraid of what lay beneath the surface. He'd paid cash for this place, every penny of his disability check and savings, while the banker's eyes had widened with something between pity and fear. The townspeople thought him mad, this grizzled veteran who chose haunted ground over the comfort of their carefully maintained ignorance. The real estate agent had tried one last time to dissuade him, her manicured fingers trembling as she pointed to the deed's fine print, warning him about the unusual circumstances that had driven away every previous owner since 1952. Tom had listened with the patience of a man who'd heard artillery fire and knew the difference between real danger and manufactured fear, his grey eyes studying the woman's face while she recited the litany of strange occurrences that supposedly plagued this stretch of New Mexico desert. She spoke of lights in the night, of sounds that had no source, of animals that refused to graze on certain patches of ground, her voice dropping to a whisper when she mentioned the 3 families who'd fled in the dead of night, leaving behind furniture and photographs as if the very walls had become poisonous. But Tom had seen real ghosts in the faces of children caught in crossfire, had felt the weight of actual curses in the form of shrapnel that still shifted beneath his skin when the weather changed. This ranch, with its broken dreams and buried secrets, felt more like home than any place he'd known since returning from wars that had no clear endings. The agent's warnings fell on ears that had heard the screams of dying men and the silence that followed, and Tom signed his name with the steady hand of someone who'd learned that running from shadows only gave them more power. When she asked why he'd chosen this particular piece of forsaken earth, Tom had simply said that sometimes a man needed to plant himself where others feared to tread, because that's where the real truth grew. Sable emerged from the trailer with the grace of a creature born to understand what humans missed, her black coat gleaming like polished obsidian in the morning light that seemed to bend differently here, as if the very air held memories that refused to fade. Tom watched his mare survey the land with eyes that saw beyond the surface, her nostrils flaring as she caught scents that carried stories from decades past, her ears swiveling to catch sounds that existed just beyond the range of human hearing. She'd been his companion for 3 years now, a rescue horse that had come to him broken and afraid, much like he'd been when the VA doctors had finally admitted there was nothing more they could do for the fragments of metal that had made their home in his spine. Together, they'd found a kind of peace in the routine of care and trust, in the simple act of one damaged soul tending to another, and Tom had learned to read the subtle language of her movements, the way she communicated truths that words could never capture. Now she stood at the edge of what would become their new life, her head raised high, as if she were listening to voices that spoke in frequencies only animals could hear. The wind picked up, sending dust devils dancing across the empty corrals, and Sable's ears pricked forward with an alertness that made Tom's own senses sharpen. She'd always been sensitive to things others missed. The approach of storms hours before clouds appeared, the presence of predators long before they showed themselves, the subtle shifts in the earth that preceded earthquakes. Tom trusted her instincts more than he trusted the opinions of the townspeople who'd spent the morning watching his arrival through curtained windows, their faces pinched with the kind of judgment that came from lives lived safely within the boundaries of accepted truth. The main house squatted like a weathered sentinel against the backdrop of mesas that rose like ancient altars toward a sky so blue it seemed to mock the darkness that supposedly haunted this place. Tom approached the front door with the measured steps of a man who'd learned to read terrain for hidden dangers, his eyes cataloguing the details that the real estate photos had failed to capture. The way the wooden porch sagged slightly to the left, the intricate metalwork on the windows that spoke of craftsmanship from an era when men built things to last, the deep scratches in the door frame that looked too deliberate to be the work of weather or time. The key turned easily in the lock, as if the house had been waiting for someone with the courage to claim it, and the door swung open to reveal rooms that held the weight of interrupted lives. Furniture covered in dust sheets like shrouded memories waiting to be awakened. Sunlight streamed through windows that hadn't been cleaned in years, creating patterns on the hardwood floors that seemed to shift and dance with each passing cloud, and Tom felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came whenever he entered spaces where violence or sorrow had left their mark. But this wasn't the sharp-edged fear he'd known in combat zones. This was something deeper, older, like the echo of a wound that had never properly healed. He moved through the rooms with the careful attention of a man mapping new territory, noting the family photographs still hanging on the walls, the children's toys abandoned in corners, the dining table set for a meal that had never been eaten. Each detail told part of a story that the town had chosen to forget, and Tom found himself wondering what truth lay buried beneath decades of willful ignorance and manufactured fear. The barn stood 50 yards from the house, its red paint faded to the color of dried blood, its massive doors hanging slightly askew on hinges that groaned like old bones when the wind caught them. Tom led Sable toward this structure that would become her new home, feeling the way she moved beside him with increasing alertness, her steps becoming more deliberate as they approached the entrance that yawned like a mouth waiting to swallow secrets. The interior was larger than it had appeared from outside, with stalls that could house a dozen horses, and a hayloft that stretched into shadows where barn owls had made their nests, their white forms ghostly against the weathered beams. Sable entered cautiously, her hooves echoing on the concrete floor that was cracked in places but still solid, still capable of bearing the weight of whatever truths this place might reveal. Tom began the familiar ritual of settling his mare into her new environment, checking the water system that still functioned despite years of neglect, testing the strength of the stall doors, spreading fresh hay in the corner where Sable would sleep. But even as he worked, he felt the weight of watching eyes, not human but something else, something that had been waiting in this place for someone brave enough or foolish enough to disturb the careful balance of secrets and silence. The townspeople's warnings echoed in his memory, but Tom had learned long ago that the things people feared most were often the things they needed most to face. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold, Tom finished his work and stood in the doorway of the barn, watching Sable explore her new home with the careful attention of a creature who understood that some places held more than they revealed. The first night on the ranch passed with the kind of deep silence that city dwellers never experienced, a quiet so complete that it seemed to have weight and substance, pressing against the windows of the old house like something alive and patient. Tom lay in the master bedroom on a cot he'd brought from his previous life, listening to the sounds that weren't quite sounds, the settling of old wood, the whisper of wind through gaps in the walls, the distant call of coyotes that seemed to carry messages in a language older than human speech. He'd faced sleepless nights before, in foxholes and field hospitals, in the sterile rooms of VA facilities where the fluorescent lights never quite dimmed. But this was different, charged with an expectancy that made his skin prickle and his old wounds ache with remembered pain. Through the window, he could see the barn silhouetted against stars that seemed brighter here, away from the light pollution of civilization, and he found himself thinking about Sable, wondering if she too felt the weight of whatever presence had made this place its home. The house creaked around him like a ship riding heavy seas, and Tom closed his eyes, letting the sounds wash over him without fear, because he'd learned that the things that went bump in the night were rarely as dangerous as the things that moved in broad daylight wearing human faces. When sleep finally came, it brought dreams of tunnels and treasure, of men in old-fashioned clothes carrying lanterns through passages carved from living rock, their faces grim with the knowledge of secrets that could destroy or redeem depending on who held them. Tom woke before dawn with the taste of earth in his mouth and the certainty that his real journey was just beginning, that the mockery of the townspeople and the warnings of the real estate agent were merely the opening notes of a song that would require all his courage to hear to its end. Dawn broke over the ranch like a revelation written in gold and crimson, painting the desert landscape in colors that seemed to pulse with life and memory, while Tom Grady stood at his kitchen window, drinking coffee that tasted of hope and possibility. Sable was already awake in the barn, her dark silhouette visible through the open doors as she moved with the restless energy of a creature who'd spent the night listening to voices that spoke in frequencies beyond human comprehension. Tom had learned to read his mare's moods like a barometer of truth, understanding that her sensitivity to the unseen world often preceded discoveries that would change everything, and this morning her behavior carried the weight of anticipation that made his own pulse quicken with something between excitement and dread. The townspeople of Esperanza would be waking soon to their carefully ordered lives, their breakfast conversations seasoned with speculation about the crazy veteran who'd bought the cursed ranch, their words carrying the bitter taste of people who'd chosen safety over truth for so long they'd forgotten the difference. But Tom had stopped caring about their opinions the moment he'd signed the deed, because he'd learned in foreign wars that the judgment of crowds was often the enemy of justice, and that real courage meant standing alone when standing together meant standing for nothing. The coffee grew cold in his hands as he watched Sable pace the confines of her stall, her movement speaking a language of urgency that he'd learned to trust more than the words of any human authority. She'd found something, or something had found her, and Tom knew that his second day on the ranch would bring revelations that would justify every whispered warning and mock decision that had led him to this moment. The morning chores took on a different quality in this place, where the very air seemed charged with electricity from some unseen source, each task carrying the weight of ritual and purpose that transformed mundane activities into acts of faith. Tom cleaned Sable's stall with the attention of a man preparing sacred ground, noting how she watched his every movement with eyes that held intelligence far beyond what most people attributed to animals, her gaze following his hands as if she were memorizing the pattern of his care for future reference. The hay he spread seemed to release scents that carried memories of other times, other hands that had performed these same tasks in this same space, and Tom found himself wondering about the men and women who'd worked this land before fear drove them away, their stories buried beneath decades of silence and superstition. Sable's water bucket reflected the morning sky like a mirror into another world, and when Tom bent to check its level, he caught a glimpse of his own face transformed by the rippling surface into something older, more weathered, as if the ranch were already changing him in ways he couldn't yet understand. The grain he poured into her feed bucket scattered like seeds of possibility, each kernel carrying the potential for growth and discovery, and Sable approached her breakfast with the careful attention of a creature who understood that nourishment came in many forms. Tom leaned against the stall door, watching his mare eat while the sun climbed higher, painting the barn interior in shades of amber and gold that seemed to reveal details invisible in artificial light. The concrete floor beneath his boots was marked with stains that could have been oil or blood or something else entirely, patterns that seemed to form shapes when viewed from certain angles, and Tom found himself studying these marks with the intensity of a man reading scripture in a foreign language. By mid-morning, the heat had begun to build toward the crushing intensity that would define the day. But inside the barn, the air remained cool and charged with the kind of energy that preceded thunderstorms or earthquakes or other acts of divine intervention. Sable had finished her breakfast, but remained restless, moving from one corner of her stall to another, with the purposeful steps of a creature following an invisible map, her ears constantly swiveling to catch sounds that existed just beyond the range of human hearing. Tom opened the stall door to let her explore the larger space of the barn, watching as she moved with increasing focus toward the far corner where shadows gathered despite the bright sunlight streaming through the open doors. She paused at a section of floor that looked identical to every other section, her nostrils flaring as she caught scents that carried information Tom couldn't access, her hooves pawing at the concrete with the deliberate rhythm of someone knocking on a door. The sound echoed strangely in the barn's vast interior, each strike seeming to awaken responses from deep beneath the earth, and Tom felt the hair on his arms rise as if the very air were becoming electrified. Sable's behavior reminded him of bomb-sniffing dogs he'd worked with overseas, the way they'd suddenly freeze and focus on seemingly empty ground that held deadly secrets, their training and instincts combining to reveal dangers invisible to human senses. But this wasn't danger Sable was detecting. This was something else, something that called to her with the voice of buried truth, waiting to be unearthed by those brave enough to dig where others feared to look. Tom approached slowly, his boots echoing on the concrete as he joined his mare in her investigation of ground that held more than it revealed. The corner where Sable had focused her attention seemed ordinary at first glance, just another section of cracked concrete floor marked by decades of use and neglect. But as Tom knelt beside his mare, he began to notice details that spoke of human intention rather than natural wear. The cracks formed patterns too regular to be random, creating lines that suggested the outline of something deliberately hidden. And when he pressed his palm against the surface, he felt a subtle difference in temperature, as if the earth beneath this spot held warmth from some internal source. Sable watched his exploration with the intense focus of a teacher waiting for a slow student to grasp an obvious lesson, her dark eyes reflecting intelligence that seemed almost human in its depth and complexity. Tom had learned to trust animal instincts during his military service, had seen dogs and horses detect threats that sophisticated equipment missed, their senses attuned to frequencies and vibrations that human technology couldn't measure. Now his mare was trying to tell him something that could change everything, her behavior speaking a language of urgency that made his own pulse quicken with anticipation. The concrete felt solid beneath his hands, but there was something about the way sound traveled in this corner, the way his voice seemed to echo differently when he spoke Sable's name that suggested empty space beneath the surface. Tom stood and walked to his truck, returning with a sledgehammer that had seen service in a dozen renovation projects, its weight familiar in his hands as he prepared to answer the question that Sable's behavior had posed. The first blow against the concrete sent vibrations through the barn floor that seemed to awaken something deep beneath the earth, and Sable stepped back with the satisfied air of a creature whose message had finally been received. Tom swung again and again, each strike revealing more of the truth that lay hidden beneath decades of careful concealment. The concrete gave way gradually, like a secret reluctantly surrendering to persistence and faith, each crack revealing glimpses of darkness that seemed to breathe with anticipation of discovery. Tom worked with the methodical intensity of a man who'd learned that the most important truths were often buried deepest, his muscles remembering the rhythm of demolition work from his younger days, when physical labor had been his escape from memories that words couldn't heal. Sable watched from a safe distance, her ears pricked forward with the alertness of a creature witnessing the fulfillment of prophecy, her presence a constant reminder that this discovery belonged as much to her as to him. The sledgehammer grew heavy in Tom's hands, but he continued his work with the determination of someone who'd come too far to turn back, each blow echoing through the barn like a heartbeat counting down to revelation. Sweat dripped from his forehead onto the broken concrete, mixing with dust that seemed to carry the scent of ages, of time compressed into layers that spoke of human ambition and divine justice. The hole grew larger with each strike, revealing glimpses of metal that gleamed dully in the filtered sunlight, and Tom felt his breath catch as he realized that Sable had led him to something that would justify every mocked decision and whispered warning that had brought him to this moment. The townspeople's fears suddenly seemed less like superstition and more like the natural response of people who'd spent generations avoiding a truth too large and dangerous for their carefully ordered lives. Tom set down the sledgehammer and knelt beside the hole he'd created, his hands trembling slightly as he reached toward whatever lay hidden in the darkness below, knowing that this moment would divide his life into before and after, into the time when he'd been just another broken veteran, and the time when he'd become something else entirely. The metal his fingers encountered was cold and smooth, worked into shapes that spoke of craftsmanship, from an era when men built things to last forever, when the weight of a secret was measured not in years, but in generations. Tom cleared away more debris, revealing hinges that had been oiled recently enough to move without protest, and a handle that fit his grip as if it had been waiting specifically for his hand to find it. Sable moved closer as he worked, her breath warm on his neck as she watched him uncover what her instincts had detected, her presence a reminder that some discoveries required the partnership of human determination and animal wisdom. The trapdoor, for that's clearly what it was, measured roughly 4 feet square, its surface marked with symbols that seemed to shift and dance in the changing light, patterns that suggested meaning just beyond the edge of understanding. Tom traced these markings with his fingertips, feeling the raised metal speak to him in a language older than words, telling stories of men who'd worked in darkness to hide treasures that could destroy or redeem depending on who claimed them. The handle turned easily in his grip, as if the mechanism had been maintained by invisible hands, and the door swung open to reveal a ladder that descended into blackness so complete it seemed to have substance and weight. Cool air rose from the opening, carrying scents of earth and metal and something else, something that reminded Tom of the incense burned in the chapel where he'd prayed for forgiveness for things he'd done in foreign wars. Sable nickered softly, her voice carrying approval and encouragement, and Tom knew that his real journey was about to begin, that everything up to this moment had been merely preparation for whatever lay waiting in the darkness below. The townspeople's mockery echoed in his memory, but now it sounded like the laughter of people who'd never had the courage to dig where angels feared to tread. Subscribe now, because the deepest treasures are always found by those willing to descend into darkness with nothing but faith as their guide. The ladder descended into darkness so complete that Tom's flashlight beam seemed to be swallowed by the earth itself, each rung taking him deeper into a space that felt carved from the very bones of the world, where the air tasted of secrets and time compressed into something tangible. Sable watched from above, her dark silhouette framed against the barn's bright interior like a guardian angel overseeing his descent into whatever truth lay buried beneath decades of fear and willful ignorance. Tom's boots found each rung with the careful precision of a man who'd learned that hasty steps in unknown territory could mean the difference between discovery and disaster. His free hand gripping the ladder, while his other held the flashlight that revealed glimpses of stone walls carved with the same mysterious symbols he'd found on the trapdoor. The descent seemed to last forever, each step taking him further from the world of sunlight and mockery into a realm where different laws applied, where the weight of buried truth pressed against him like water at the bottom of a deep well. His breathing echoed strangely in the confined space, each exhale seeming to awaken responses from the darkness ahead, and Tom found himself counting rungs like a rosary, each number a prayer for courage to face whatever revelation awaited him in the depths. The ladder ended at a platform carved from living rock, and Tom stepped onto stone that had been shaped by human hands but felt older than human memory, his flashlight beam revealing the mouth of a tunnel that stretched beyond the reach of his light. The air here carried scents that spoke of ages, the metallic tang of ore, the earthy richness of deep soil, the faint sweetness of something that might have been incense or might have been decay. Tom called up to Sable, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space, and heard her answering whinny, like a blessing from above, a reminder that he wasn't alone in this journey into the buried heart of whatever secret had made the townspeople afraid. The tunnel stretched ahead like a throat waiting to swallow him, its walls carved with the precision of men who'd worked by lamplight and faith, creating passages that spoke of purpose beyond mere excavation, of plans that required generations to fulfill. Tom moved forward with the cautious steps of a soldier entering enemy territory, his flashlight beam revealing details that told stories of human ambition and divine intervention. Tool marks that showed the rhythm of picks and shovels, support beams that had been placed with mathematical precision, ventilation shafts that still carried fresh air from some distant source. The floor beneath his boots was smooth stone, worn by the passage of countless feet, and Tom found himself wondering how many men had walked this path before him, carrying lanterns and secrets, and the weight of knowledge that could change everything. The walls were marked with dates carved deep into the rock, 1847, 1848, 1849, years that spoke of the Mexican-American War and the gold rush that had transformed the Southwest from wilderness into territory worth fighting for. But these weren't the crude scratchings of miners or soldiers. These were the careful markings of men who'd understood that they were creating something that would outlast their own lives, a legacy carved in stone and hidden from eyes that weren't ready to see. Tom's flashlight beam caught the glint of metal ahead, and he quickened his pace despite the voice in his head that warned him to proceed with caution, because he'd learned that some discoveries couldn't wait for perfect preparation. The tunnel curved slightly to the left, following some natural contour of the rock, and Tom felt the weight of the earth above him like a reminder that he was walking in spaces where few men had ever trod, where the very air held the breath of those who'd worked and died to create this hidden world. The chamber that opened before him defied every expectation he'd formed during his descent. A vast space carved from solid rock with the precision of a cathedral, its walls rising into darkness that his flashlight couldn't penetrate, its floor marked with patterns that seemed to pulse with their own internal light. Tom stepped into this underground sanctuary with the reverence of a man entering holy ground, his breath catching as his light revealed details that spoke of craftsmanship beyond anything he'd imagined possible in this remote corner of New Mexico desert. The walls were covered with murals, painted in pigments that still held their color after more than a century, depicting scenes of men in period clothing carrying chests and strong boxes, their faces grim with the weight of responsibility and secret knowledge. These weren't the crude drawings of amateur artists. These were the work of someone who'd understood that they were creating a record for future generations, a visual testament to events that official history had chosen to forget. Tom moved his flashlight slowly across the painted surfaces, reading the story they told. Soldiers, in blue uniforms working alongside men in civilian clothes, all of them united in some common purpose that required absolute secrecy and unwavering faith. The dates painted beneath each scene confirmed what the tunnel carvings had suggested. This work had been done during the chaotic years following the Mexican-American War, when the boundaries between nations were still being drawn and fortunes could be made or lost with a single decision. But this wasn't just about money. The reverent expressions on the painted faces suggested something deeper, something that touched the realm of the sacred and the eternal. Tom felt the weight of discovery settling on his shoulders like a mantle of responsibility, understanding that he'd stumbled onto something that could rewrite the history of this entire region, something that would justify every mocked decision and whispered warning that had led him to this moment. The center of the chamber held a sight that made Tom's hands tremble as he adjusted his flashlight beam, revealing a collection of wooden chests and metal strongboxes arranged with the precision of an altar, each container marked with symbols that matched those he'd found on the trapdoor and tunnel walls. The wood had been preserved by the dry air and constant temperature, showing only the patina of age rather than the rot and decay he'd expected, and the metal fittings gleamed as if they'd been polished yesterday by invisible hands. Tom approached these containers with the careful steps of a man walking on sacred ground, understanding that he was looking at more than just hidden treasure. He was seeing the physical manifestation of secrets that had shaped the destiny of this land and its people. The largest chest bore a brass plate engraved with words that made his pulse quicken: Sacred Trust of the Brotherhood of the Desert Cross, Anno Domini 1848, for the glory of God and the salvation of the faithful. Tom's military training had taught him to recognize the signs of organized resistance movements, and these markings spoke of something far more complex than simple treasure hunting. They suggested a secret society with religious overtones, men who'd believed they were serving a higher purpose that transcended national boundaries and personal gain. The other containers bore similar markings, each one telling part of a larger story that Tom was only beginning to understand. A narrative that connected the chaos of post-war politics with the eternal struggle between good and evil, between those who would hide truth and those who would reveal it. His flashlight beam caught the glint of gold through the gaps in one partially opened chest, but Tom found himself more interested in the documents that protruded from another container, papers that might hold the key to understanding why this place had been hidden and why the townspeople still feared it after all these years. The documents, when Tom carefully extracted them from their protective wrapping, told a story that made the townspeople's fears seem not only justified, but inadequate to the magnitude of what had been hidden here. Written in the careful script of educated men, these papers detailed a conspiracy that reached from the highest levels of territorial government to the humblest parish churches. A network of believers who'd understood that the chaos following the Mexican-American War provided an opportunity to secure resources for a cause that transcended earthly politics. The Brotherhood of the Desert Cross had been composed of priests, soldiers, merchants and ranchers who'd united around a shared vision of creating a sanctuary for persecuted Christians fleeing the religious wars that were tearing apart Europe and Mexico. The gold and silver stored in these chests represented not stolen treasure, but carefully accumulated resources intended to fund the establishment of a hidden community where faith could flourish without interference from hostile governments or competing denominations. Tom read by flashlight about secret masses held in desert caves, about supply lines that stretched from California to Texas, about plans for a network of safe houses that would allow believers to travel across the continent without fear of persecution or violence. The document spoke of miracles and divine intervention, of supplies appearing when they were most needed, of enemies being turned away by forces they couldn't understand or explain. But they also told of betrayal and discovery, of government agents who'd infiltrated the Brotherhood and learned enough to threaten the entire operation, forcing the faithful to hide their resources and scatter to the winds rather than see their sacred mission destroyed by worldly authorities. The final document, dated December 1851, spoke of a curse pronounced by the Brotherhood's leader, a Franciscan priest named Father Miguel Santos, who declared that this treasure would remain hidden until God sent someone worthy to claim it, someone who'd been tested by fire and proven faithful in the face of mockery and persecution. The weight of this revelation settled on Tom like a physical force, pressing him to his knees on the stone floor as he understood that his purchase of this ranch hadn't been coincidence but providence, that every mocked decision and whispered warning had been leading him to this moment of discovery and responsibility. The townspeople's fears suddenly made perfect sense. They were the descendants of those who'd betrayed the Brotherhood, whose ancestors had sold sacred secrets for government gold, and their collective guilt had been passed down through generations like a genetic curse. Tom's own journey from broken veteran to unlikely discoverer began to feel less like random chance and more like divine appointment, as if his suffering in foreign wars had been preparation for this moment when he would be called to serve a purpose larger than his own healing. The document spoke of signs that would mark the chosen one, a man tested by fire, marked by metal, faithful despite mockery, accompanied by a creature of unusual wisdom, and Tom felt the fragments of shrapnel in his spine pulse with recognition as he realized that his wounds had been more than just the random casualties of war. Sable's behavior, her immediate connection to this place, her uncanny ability to detect what others missed, suddenly seemed less like animal instinct and more like divine guidance, as if she too had been chosen for this moment when buried truth would finally see the light. Tom gathered the documents with trembling hands, understanding that he held in his grasp not just historical artifacts, but a sacred trust that would require all his courage and faith to fulfill. The gold and silver in the chests represented resources for a mission that hadn't ended with the Brotherhood's dispersal, but had simply been waiting for the right person to continue their work. And Tom felt the weight of that responsibility settling on his shoulders like armor forged in heaven's fires. Subscribe now, because some treasures carry obligations that transform the finder into something far greater than they ever imagined possible. The climb back to the surface felt like ascending from one world into another, each rung of the ladder carrying Tom further from the realm of buried truth into the harsh light of a reality that would never look the same again. Sable waited at the top with the patience of a creature who'd known all along that this moment would come, her dark eyes reflecting understanding that seemed to encompass not just what Tom had discovered, but what it would mean for both of them in the days ahead. The barn felt different now, charged with the energy of revelation, its ordinary walls and floors transformed into the entrance to a sacred space that held the power to change everything the townspeople thought they knew about their carefully ordered world. Tom's hands shook as he pulled the documents from his jacket, spreading them on a hay bale, while Sable watched with the intense focus of a congregation witnessing the reading of scripture, her presence a reminder that some discoveries required witnesses to make them real. The afternoon sun slanted through the barn doors, illuminating the ancient papers with light that seemed to make the faded ink pulse with renewed life. And Tom found himself reading the words again, searching for details he might have missed in the underground chamber's uncertain illumination. Each document told part of a larger story that connected his own journey from broken veteran to unlikely guardian, with a mission that had been waiting more than a century for the right person to claim it. And Tom felt the weight of that responsibility settling into his bones like shrapnel that would never be removed. The Brotherhood of the Desert Cross hadn't simply hidden treasure. They'd created a legacy that required someone with the courage to face mockery and persecution, someone who'd been tested by fire and proven faithful when faith seemed foolish, someone exactly like the grizzled veteran the townspeople had dismissed as crazy for buying cursed land. The implications of his discovery began to unfold, like a map of possibilities that stretched far beyond the boundaries of this remote ranch, touching lives and communities across the Southwest in ways that Tom was only beginning to understand. The document spoke of other caches hidden throughout the territory, of a network of safe houses and supply routes that could still serve their original purpose if someone had the vision and courage to resurrect the Brotherhood's mission. Tom thought of the homeless veterans he'd known, men and women who'd served their country faithfully, only to find themselves abandoned by the very society they'd sworn to protect. And he began to see how the Brotherhood's resources could be used to create the kind of sanctuary that Father Miguel Santos had envisioned more than a century ago. The gold and silver in the underground chamber represented more than historical artifacts. They were the foundation for a modern mission that could provide healing and hope for those who'd been broken by war and forgotten by peace. A place where faith could flourish without interference from bureaucrats who measured success in statistics rather than souls. Sable moved closer as Tom read, her warm breath on his shoulder, a reminder that he wasn't alone in this moment of overwhelming possibility, that the same divine providence that had led him to this discovery would provide the wisdom and strength needed to fulfill the trust that had been placed in his hands. The townspeople's mockery echoed in his memory, but now it sounded like the laughter of people who'd never understood that God often chose the foolish things of the world to confound the wise, that the very qualities they'd seen as weaknesses, his stubbornness, his willingness to stand alone, his refusal to accept their version of reality, were exactly what this mission required. Tom folded the documents carefully, understanding that he held in his hands not just the key to understanding the past, but the blueprint for transforming the future. The sound of approaching vehicles broke the sacred silence of the barn, and Tom looked up to see a convoy of pickup trucks raising dust clouds on the ranch road, their occupants no doubt drawn by curiosity about the crazy veteran who'd spent his first full day on the cursed land without fleeing in terror. Sable's ears pricked forward with alertness that bordered on alarm, her body tensing as she detected something in the approaching visitors that Tom's human senses couldn't yet perceive, and he found himself trusting her instincts more than the evidence of his own eyes. The lead truck bore the logo of the Esperanza Sheriff's Department, followed by vehicles that Tom recognized from his brief encounters with the townspeople. The banker who'd processed his purchase, the real estate agent who'd tried to dissuade him, the mayor who'd made it clear that outsiders weren't particularly welcome in their carefully insulated community. Tom quickly gathered the documents and secured them in a metal toolbox, understanding instinctively that these visitors hadn't come to welcome him to the neighborhood, but to investigate whatever disturbance his presence might have caused to their delicate balance of secrets and silence. The trapdoor lay open like a wound in the barn floor, its dark mouth speaking truths that these people had spent generations trying to forget. And Tom realized that his discovery had somehow triggered alarms that reached far beyond the boundaries of his property. Sable moved to stand beside him, her presence a source of strength and comfort as the vehicles drew closer, their engines growing louder in the desert silence like the approach of a storm that would test everything he'd learned about faith and courage. The Brotherhood's documents had warned of persecution and betrayal, of worldly authorities who would stop at nothing to prevent the faithful from fulfilling their sacred mission. and Tom felt the weight of history settling on his shoulders as he prepared to face the first challenge to his newfound role as guardian of buried truth. Sheriff Martinez emerged from the lead vehicle with the careful movements of a man who'd learned to read danger in the smallest details, his eyes scanning the barn interior with the professional assessment of someone who'd spent years dealing with situations that didn't fit into neat categories. The other visitors followed with varying degrees of reluctance, their faces showing the kind of nervous tension that came from approaching something they'd been taught to fear, but couldn't quite explain, and Tom found himself studying their expressions for clues about how much they actually knew about the ranch's hidden secrets. The banker, a thin man named Castellanos, who'd processed Tom's purchase with obvious reluctance, kept glancing toward the open trapdoor with the kind of recognition that suggested this wasn't his first encounter with the ranch's underground mysteries. The real estate agent, Mrs. Valdez, clutched her purse like a shield against forces she couldn't name, her carefully applied makeup unable to hide the pallor that had crept across her features since entering the barn. Mayor Rodriguez, a heavy-set man who'd made his political career by avoiding difficult questions, stood near the entrance as if ready to flee at the first sign of whatever supernatural forces the townspeople believed haunted this place. Tom watched them all with the patient attention of a soldier assessing potential threats, understanding that these people represented more than just curious neighbors. They were the descendants of those who'd betrayed the Brotherhood, and their presence here suggested that his discovery had awakened fears that had been sleeping for generations. Sable remained close to his side, her body language speaking of readiness for whatever confrontation might come, and Tom felt grateful for her presence as he prepared to face questions that would test his ability to protect the sacred trust that had been placed in his care. Sheriff Martinez spoke first, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a lawman who'd learned to navigate the treacherous waters of small-town politics without taking sides that might cost him his job. "Mr. Grady, we've had some reports of unusual activity out here. Sounds, lights, that sort of thing. Just wanted to check and make sure everything's all right." Tom met the sheriff's gaze with the steady attention of a man who'd learned to read the subtext beneath official words, understanding that this visit had nothing to do with noise complaints and everything to do with the trapdoor that yawned like an accusation in the barn floor. The other visitors shifted nervously behind the sheriff, their eyes drawn repeatedly to the opening that revealed the ladder descending into darkness, and Tom realized that these people knew exactly what lay beneath their feet. They'd always known, had spent their entire lives avoiding this place because their ancestors had passed down warnings about disturbing what the Brotherhood had hidden. Mrs. Valdez stepped forward with the kind of forced courage that came from desperation, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Mr. Grady, I feel I should have been more explicit about the unusual circumstances surrounding this property. There are things here that are better left undisturbed, forces that have been sleeping for a very long time." Tom listened to her words while studying the faces of the other visitors, seeing in their expressions the weight of inherited guilt and fear that had shaped their community's relationship with this land for more than a century. Mayor Rodriguez cleared his throat nervously, his political instincts warring with his obvious desire to be anywhere else. "Perhaps we could discuss this matter in a more appropriate setting. The town hall, maybe, where we could explain the full history of this place and help you understand why previous owners have found it challenging to remain here." Tom felt Sable's warm presence beside him, her steady breathing a reminder that he wasn't alone in this confrontation with people who'd spent their lives running from the very truth he'd been chosen to protect. The weight of the moment pressed against Tom like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm, charged with the electricity of secrets about to be revealed and lies about to be exposed, while the townspeople waited for his response with the nervous energy of people who'd built their entire world on a foundation of willful ignorance. Tom looked at each face in turn, reading the fear and guilt that had been passed down through generations like a genetic curse, understanding that these people weren't his enemies, but victims of their own ancestors' betrayal of sacred trust. The documents hidden in his toolbox spoke of forgiveness and redemption, of a mission that transcended the boundaries of revenge and retribution, and Tom felt the weight of that wisdom settling into his heart like balm on old wounds. Sheriff Martinez shifted impatiently, his hand resting on his radio as if preparing to call for backup, but Tom could see in the man's eyes the same uncertainty that marked all the visitors. They knew something was different about this place, but they'd never had the courage to discover what that difference meant. The barn around them seemed to pulse with the energy of revelation, its ordinary walls and floors transformed into the threshold between the world of surface appearances and the deeper reality that lay hidden beneath decades of fear and denial. Sable nickered softly, her voice carrying encouragement and strength, and Tom felt his resolve crystallize into something harder than steel and more precious than gold. These people had come expecting to find a crazy veteran who could be intimidated or bought off, but instead they'd found someone who'd been chosen for a purpose that transcended their small-town politics and inherited fears. Tom straightened his shoulders, feeling the weight of the Brotherhood's mission settling on him like armor forged in heaven's fires, and prepared to speak words that would change everything these people thought they knew about their carefully ordered world. The time for hiding was over. The time for truth had finally come. Subscribe now, because the moment when buried secrets meet the light of day is when ordinary people discover they're capable of extraordinary courage. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch as Tom emerged from the tunnel, his arms laden with artifacts that seemed to pulse with the weight of forgotten time. Sable stood sentinel by the barn entrance, her dark eyes reflecting an ancient wisdom that spoke of secrets finally ready to be born into light. The leather satchels he carried contained more than gold coins and faded documents. They held the compressed grief of generations, the crystallized pain of families torn apart by greed and betrayal. Each step toward the house felt like walking through layers of history, each footfall disturbing the settled dust of decades-old lies. The wind whispered through the cottonwoods with a different voice now, no longer mournful, but expectant, as if the very land itself was preparing to exhale truths it had held too long in its buried chest. Tom's weathered hands trembled not from age, but from the magnitude of what he carried, understanding that some discoveries change not just the finder, but the entire fabric of a community's understanding of itself. The ranch that had been his refuge was transforming into something far more significant, a place where the past would finally meet its reckoning. Inside the house, Tom spread the contents across his kitchen table like a battlefield commander studying maps before a crucial engagement. Yellowed letters tied with ribbon spoke of love affairs and business partnerships that had soured into violence, while hand-drawn maps revealed the true route of a gold shipment that had supposedly vanished without trace in 1887. The coins themselves bore the weight of more than their precious metal. Each one represented a life disrupted, a family destroyed, a truth buried beneath layers of convenient fiction. As he read through the correspondence, Tom began to understand the intricate web of deception that had torn through Esperanza like a plague, turning neighbor against neighbor and brother against brother. The supposed curse on his ranch wasn't supernatural at all. It was the collective guilt of a town that had chosen comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. His fingers traced the faded ink of a confession letter written by a dying man who could no longer bear the weight of his silence, and Tom felt the familiar burn of recognition that came from understanding how secrets could poison a soul. The veteran in him recognized the symptoms of a community suffering from collective trauma, the kind that festers when truth is sacrificed for the illusion of peace. The sound of approaching vehicles broke through his concentration, like artillery fire, disturbing a moment of prayer. Through the window, Tom watched as a convoy of trucks wound up his dirt road, their dust clouds rising like smoke signals announcing the arrival of those who had spent decades ensuring these secrets remained buried. Mayor Hendricks led the procession, his face set in the grim determination of a man who had built his entire political career on the foundation of selective memory and strategic amnesia. Behind him came the descendants of the original conspirators, families whose prosperity had been built on the bones of the betrayed, whose social standing depended on maintaining the fiction that their ancestors had been honorable pioneers rather than opportunistic thieves. Tom felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came before combat, the heightened awareness that preceded moments when everything hung in the balance. These weren't just neighbors coming to visit. They were the guardians of a lie so fundamental to their identity that they would fight to preserve it with the desperation of drowning men. The ranch that had been his sanctuary was about to become a battleground, and Tom understood with crystal clarity that some wars were worth fighting regardless of the odds. Sable's warning whinny from the corral carried across the yard like a battle cry, her instincts alerting her to the approaching danger with the same precision that had guided her to the hidden trapdoor. Tom moved to his gun cabinet with the fluid efficiency of muscle memory, not because he sought violence, but because he understood that truth often required protection from those who profited from its absence. The weight of his service revolver felt familiar in his hands, a reminder of other times when he had stood between right and wrong with nothing but his conviction and his training to guide him. Through the window, he could see Mayor Hendricks organizing his people like a general preparing for siege, their faces bearing the hard determination of those who had too much to lose to allow the past to surface. The irony wasn't lost on Tom that he, the supposed eccentric who had bought a cursed ranch, was about to become the guardian of truth against those who claimed to represent law and order. His years of military service had taught him that the most dangerous enemies were often those who wrapped their corruption in the flag of respectability, who used their positions of trust to perpetuate injustice. The artifacts spread across his table weren't just historical curiosities. They were weapons in a war between truth and comfortable fiction, and Tom had no intention of surrendering them to those who would see them buried again. The knock on his door came with the false courtesy of those who believed their authority gave them the right to enter any space and claim any truth as their own. Tom opened it to find Mayor Hendricks, flanked by two men whose expensive suits couldn't quite hide the predatory gleam in their eyes. Lawyers, most likely, or perhaps private investigators hired to clean up messes that threatened carefully constructed narratives. "Tom," Hendricks began, his voice carrying the patronizing tone of someone addressing a child who had found something they shouldn't have. "We need to talk about what you've discovered on your property." The mayor's eyes darted past Tom toward the kitchen table, where the artifacts lay spread like evidence in a courtroom, and Tom could see the calculation behind his gaze, the rapid assessment of how much damage these revelations could cause to carefully maintained reputations. The other men shifted restlessly, their body language speaking of barely contained urgency and the kind of nervous energy that came from knowing that decades of careful planning hung in the balance. Tom stepped back to allow them entry, not from courtesy, but from the tactical understanding that it was better to face enemies where you could control the terrain than to let them choose the battlefield. The ranch that had been his refuge was about to become the stage for a confrontation that had been building for over a century, and Tom felt the familiar calm that came from finally understanding the true nature of the war he was fighting. As the men entered his home, Tom felt the weight of history settling around them like dust disturbed by careless footsteps. These weren't just visitors seeking to negotiate the return of stolen property. They were the inheritors of a conspiracy so deep and so fundamental to their community's identity that its exposure would shake the very foundations of everything they believed about themselves. The artifacts on his table represented more than historical curiosities. They were proof that the founding families of Esperanza had built their prosperity on theft and murder, that the heroes celebrated in the town square had been nothing more than common criminals who had successfully rewritten history to cast themselves as victims rather than perpetrators. Tom understood that the next few minutes would determine not just the fate of the gold and documents he had discovered, but the very soul of a community that had chosen comfortable lies over painful truths for more than a century. The veteran in him recognized this moment as the kind of crossroads where character was revealed and destinies were decided, where the choice between right and wrong became as clear and stark as the difference between light and darkness. His ranch, his horse, and his stubborn refusal to accept the town's warnings had led him to this moment of reckoning, and Tom Grady had no intention of backing down from the fight that had been waiting for him all along. Subscribe now, because when the guardians of buried secrets come calling, only those who understand the true cost of silence can stand against them. The town square had never seen such a gathering. Tom stood before the assembled crowd, the weathered leather satchel at his feet containing documents that would rewrite their history. Mayor Hutchins shifted nervously as Tom's calloused hands withdrew the first piece of evidence. A bill of sale bearing the signature of the town's founding father, proving the Castellanos family had legitimately purchased the land that became the heart of their community. The crowd's murmur grew to a roar as Tom displayed photograph after photograph, each one showing the systematic destruction of the Mexican family's property, the burning of their crops, the theft of their livestock by men whose descendants now sat on the town council. Sable waited by the courthouse steps, her presence a silent testament to the truth that had been buried for over a century. The horse's steady breathing seemed to anchor Tom as he faced the hostile stares of those who had mocked his purchase. Their laughter now turned to ash in their mouths. Mrs. Patterson, whose great-grandfather had led the campaign against the Castellanos family, wept openly as Tom read aloud from a diary entry describing the night they drove the family from their home at gunpoint. The words cut through the desert air like a blade, each sentence a condemnation of the lies that had built their prosperity on stolen ground. The sheriff, a man whose badge carried the weight of generations of corruption, stepped forward with trembling hands. His voice cracked as he admitted that his own family had participated in the cover-up, burying evidence and intimidating witnesses who might have spoken the truth. Tom's eyes never wavered as he listened to the confession, his weathered face a map of understanding that forgiveness was not his to give. It belonged to the dead who had been silenced. The crowd began to disperse, some in shame, others in anger, but all carrying the burden of a truth that could no longer be denied. As the sun reached its zenith, Tom gathered the scattered documents with the reverence of a man handling sacred relics. Each paper represented a life destroyed, a dream shattered, a family torn from their rightful place in the world. Sable approached slowly, her muzzle gently touching the veteran's shoulder as if to remind him that justice, though delayed, had finally found its voice. The ranch that everyone had called cursed was revealed to be blessed, a keeper of truth waiting for the right guardian to set it free. Subscribe now, because when a man stands alone against a town's lies, he discovers that truth is the only weapon that never fails. The weeks that followed the revelation transformed the ranch from a place of whispered fears into a shrine of remembrance. Tom worked tirelessly to restore the property, each nail driven into weathered wood, a small act of penance for the sins of previous generations. Sable grazed peacefully in fields that had once echoed with the cries of the dispossessed, her presence a living bridge between the pain of the past and the possibility of redemption. The veteran's hands, scarred by war and hardened by years of labor, now moved with the gentleness of a man tending sacred ground. Visitors began arriving from distant places, descendants of the Castellanos family who had scattered across the southwest like seeds on barren ground. Maria Elena Castellanos, a teacher from Phoenix, whose great-great-grandmother had been forced to flee in the night, stood in the barn where her ancestors' treasures had been hidden for over a century. Her tears fell onto the same earth that had absorbed the blood and sweat of her family's stolen dreams, each drop a baptism of memory long overdue. Tom watched from a respectful distance as she traced her fingers along the tunnel walls, reading the Spanish words carved by desperate hands in their final hours on the land they loved. The town's transformation was slower, but no less profound. Businesses that had thrived on the mythology of their noble founding began to crumble under the weight of historical truth. The Hutchins family, whose political dynasty had been built on the foundation of stolen prosperity, quietly left town in the dead of night, their departure as cowardly as their ancestors' crimes. New families moved in, people who understood that healing required acknowledgement, that progress demanded the courage to face uncomfortable truths about the past. Sable became the unofficial guardian of the memorial that Tom established in the ranch's main pasture. A simple stone marker bore the names of the Castellanos family members who had been driven from their home, their stories finally given voice after more than a century of silence. The horse would often stand beside the monument at sunset, her silhouette a powerful reminder that some wounds can only be healed when the truth is finally allowed to breathe. Children from the local school began visiting, learning a history that had been deliberately erased from their textbooks, their young minds absorbing lessons about justice that their grandparents had refused to teach. Subscribe now, because when broken ground is finally blessed with truth, it becomes fertile soil for a future built on justice rather than lies. As autumn painted the New Mexico landscape in shades of gold and crimson, Tom stood on his porch, watching Sable lead a small herd of rescued horses across the pasture that had once been a battlefield of injustice. The ranch had become a sanctuary, not just for animals, but for the healing of historical wounds that had festered in darkness for too long. Letters arrived daily from historians, journalists, and family members seeking to piece together the full story of what had been hidden beneath the desert floor. Each correspondence was a thread in a tapestry of truth that Tom carefully wove together, his military precision serving him well in the delicate work of historical restoration. The tunnel system had been converted into a museum, its walls lined with the artifacts that told the story of a family's persecution and a community's complicity in their suffering. Tom served as the reluctant curator, his gruff exterior hiding a deep reverence for the responsibility he had inherited. Visitors walked through the underground chambers in hushed silence, their footsteps echoing in spaces where desperate prayers had once been whispered in Spanish and English alike. The veteran's voice, weathered by years of command and hardened by the realities of war, now carried the gentle authority of a man who understood that some battles are fought not with weapons, but with the patient persistence of truth. Sable had become something of a legend herself, her story spreading through social media and local news outlets as the horse who had uncovered one of the Southwest's most significant historical discoveries. Children drew pictures of the black mare, their innocent artwork capturing the mystical quality that seemed to surround her presence on the ranch. Tom would often find offerings left at the barn door, carrots, apples, and handwritten notes from young visitors who understood instinctively that Sable was more than just a horse. She was a guardian of memory and a symbol of the power that comes from listening to the wisdom of the innocent. The veteran's own transformation was perhaps the most remarkable of all. The man who had been mocked for his eccentric purchase now carried himself with the quiet dignity of someone who had been chosen for a purpose greater than himself. His nightmares from the war had not disappeared, but they had been joined by dreams of the Castellanos family, visions of their gratitude for finally being remembered and honored. Tom understood that his role as guardian of their story was not a burden, but a blessing, a chance to serve his country in a way that brought healing rather than destruction. Subscribe now, because when a veteran finds his true mission, he discovers that the greatest battles are fought not on foreign soil, but in the sacred ground of his own backyard, where truth and justice finally come home.